Steve Mosher, thank you for being with us on this special episode of the John Henry Weston Show.
Well, thank you, John Henry, for having me. These are times that try men's souls.
Absolutely. And because of these times, and specifically because of the consternation we're dealing with, your role right now as a Catholic advisor to the Trump 2020 campaign and being on those daily calls to get updates, that's really what we're looking for, because we're trying to make sense of this. We're seeing reports all over the place, elector fraud, and we're looking at the vote counts and seeing it looks like the media totally miscalled this. Where are we at right now? Tell us what's going on.
Well, I would make a couple of points here first, John Henry, before we get into the details of the election fraud. Really, not just fraud, it's the election heist, because the mainstream media conspiring with the progressives, the left wing of the Democrat Party are trying to steal the election. And really, they're not just trying to steal the election, they're trying to steal our country, because if they succeed in the massive election heist that's currently underway, we'll never have another free and fair election in this country, I'm afraid. So this really is one for the record books. This really is one that we're looking at an attempted coup in the United States of America. A bloodless coup, of course, but a coup nonetheless. First of all, a couple of points that need to be clear in people's minds. President Trump handily won re-election on election night. Then the election was held, of course, last week, November 3rd, and it ended at 8 o'clock that evening when all the votes were supposed to be in. And if those ballots had been accurately counted, President Trump would not only be winning the majority of the Electoral College, he would actually be winning the majority of the popular vote in this country. I think his popular vote right now, all legal votes, of course, for President Trump, is about at 73 million. Biden is supposed to have 77 million ballots floating around somewhere, but actually a couple million votes were taken away from President Trump illegally and given again illegally to Biden, who is not president-elect, and the popular vote totals would therefore actually be reversed. So I think President Trump won re-election, he won the popular vote, and of course he won the Electoral College vote. So that's the first thing that people have to keep in mind. The other thing that is probably hard for people to understand is how massive, how absolutely massive the fraud has been. It has encompassed every possible kind of the old school ballot fraud, right? The ballot box stuffing and finding ballots in the middle of the night and dead people voting and so forth. We can go into that in more detail in a minute. But it also has, that's the old 20th century, 19th century voter fraud. But now we have the 21st century voter fraud. These computer voting systems became popular in the early years of this century, the 21st century. And boy, it enables an entirely new way of cheating on the vote. And we can get into that in more detail in a minute. But there are, it's going on in every state. It's going on all across the United States of America, not just in the key swing states that we're talking about, but there's been fraud everywhere. And I think there's been fraud probably for the last 10 or 15 years using these computer voting systems. I personally believe, for example, that Bernie Sanders should have won the Democratic nomination this time around, and that they used computer voting fraud to cheat him out of the nomination and push old Joe Biden across the finish line.
Wow. Okay, you've said an awful lot there, but let me pick on, I think, the thing that will really be on people's minds right now after what you just said. Where are you getting these numbers from? You've said, you've given specific numbers about President Trump's vote and President taking the election legally. Where are these numbers coming from?
Well, the numbers are coming from all over, but one good source is actually the New York Times, because they did us a great favor. I know you're saying the New York Times, are you kidding? No, on election night, they were publishing in real time updates on the voting totals all over the country, all right? The data for the New York Times came from a company known as Edison, which was tracking the vote everywhere. And so you're able to have, you have now a complete data set updated by the minute for all 50 states. And if you do data analysis, as a number of people have, I've looked at the data myself, of these voting totals, you see some very interesting things happening in multiple states. Again, this just isn't one state problem. This isn't just a problem in Detroit, Michigan, or Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is a nationwide problem, and these are nationwide vote totals by state. So what happens in the middle of the night is the votes start being counted, and Trump's vote is increasing and Biden's vote is increasing a little slower. And then all of a sudden, you have, in one update, you have 20,000 votes switched from Trump to Biden in one state at one time. And Trump's vote goes down by 20,000 at the same time that Joe Biden's vote total goes up by 20,000. So that's one form of fraud, okay, computer fraud. We have the actual switching of chunks of votes from one candidate to another. And you see that again and again. It's not just one time. It happens again and again in state after state after state. It happens in Virginia. In fact, it happens in Georgia. It happens in Arizona.
Now, have these been caught? How do you know about this?
Well, because we have the data set. And I can actually I would be happy to send to anybody who's interested a complete printout of all of the vote switches that have taken place. And I can give you actual vote totals based on the data from Edison, kindly published, made available to the public by the New York Times. And the total number of votes that President Trump was defrauded of is over 2 million. Now, I know that sounds like a large number, but remember, we have 150 million people in the United States who voted in this election, and we have millions of ballots floating around. Now, people need to understand, first of all, that a ballot is not a vote. A ballot is a piece of paper, and it only becomes a vote if the person who fills out that piece of paper is a legal voter. That is, they're an American citizen, not here illegally, that they're registered to vote in advance or according to the law in the country or county that they're voting in, and that it's properly recorded and can be verified. There are lots of pieces of paper floating around called ballots that aren't votes at all, because they were filled out by people who don't exist. These are ghost voters. They were filled out supposedly by people who came back from the dead to vote. Now, I think our voting obligation is important, but I don't think people come back from the dead to vote.
From the dead, no. That's that great joke going around Twitter and Facebook about the Vatican is thinking of canonizing Joe Biden because he's raised millions of people to vote from the dead.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny in a sad sort of way, but we will be able to laugh about it in a few weeks. But right now, it's a little too close to home for comfort. But okay. So now we have these Dominion voting systems. Dominion is a company that creates manufactures these computer voting systems. They look like big. Everybody has seen them, right? If they've gone in to vote, they've seen these big square box-like structures standing waist high that you feed your ballot into, and that reads your ballot. What people need to know is what happens then. Well, in some states, what happens then is the image of your ballot is saved, the paper ballot itself is saved, and it registers the vote accurately. But in some of the Dominion voting machines, an image of your ballot is not saved. So there's no actual image of your ballot stored in the computer memory. Instead, your ballot sort of dissolves into a series of numbers, and we all know that you can change numbers in a computer system very easily. You don't have to be a sophisticated computer programmer to know how to do those things, right? We've all done Photoshop and other things. We know how easily data pixels, data numbers on computers are manipulated. So what happens when that data goes into the computer? Well, there are a number of ways to cheat. You can do the vote switching that I talked about. But here's another way, John Henry, and this is a little more difficult, to make clear by just talking about it, but let me try. The word Republican is spelled REPLICAN, right? Republican, all right?
Yeah.
And it has an L and an I. Well, what does a capital I look like? Capital I looks like an L, doesn't it? So in some of these systems, instead of an L, they put a capital I. So when you go to vote, I know this sounds kind of hokey, but we actually have physical evidence of this in ballots from different parts of the country. That when you go to vote and you vote for the Republican slate, you're actually not voting for the REPLICAN slate. You're voting for the REPIICAN voting slate, which is different. You can't see it, but the computer sees it differently, and it takes your vote away from the Republicans and sends it to the Republicans, who are actually the Democrats. All right?
Oh gosh.
Now, think about that. It's very clever, isn't it? Because you go into the voting booth, you think you're clicking on the Republican, you're actually clicking on a clever deception that sends your vote somewhere else in the system, and it counts not for the Republican, but for the Democrats. And remember, every time that happens, it takes one vote away from the Republican and adds one vote to the Democrat. So it has a double effect, right?
Yeah.
So one analysis of the votes in 3 Michigan counties, the 2 suburban counties surrounding Detroit, Michigan, Macomb and Oakland, and another urban suburban county, Kent County in Wisconsin surrounding Grand Rapids, showed that over the course of the vote, 69,000 votes were switched in those 3 counties alone from Trump to Biden. Now, actually, if you switch 69,000 votes, you're actually giving Biden an advantage of double that, or 138,000, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, these are big numbers. And as I say, Trump won the election hands down. And I think this accounts for the massive wave of voter fraud that we're seeing. The fraud was planned. It is systematic. It is nationwide. But they had to scramble in the middle of the night. Why? Because they didn't anticipate that Trump's margin would be as large as it was. I think they were sort of gaslighted by their own polls. I mean, in Wisconsin, John Henry, they thought they had a poll that came out showing them 17 percentage points ahead. And they knew that was an exaggeration. But I don't think that even the Democrat operatives knew how much of an exaggeration it was, how easily Trump was going to win Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. That's why in the middle of the night, almost simultaneously, Georgia and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona shut down their counting. Now, why do you stop the counting of ballots? Well, this is not 21st century ballot stuff, ballot fraud. This is old school ballot fraud. This is the kind of fraud that used to occur in the Democratic machines in Chicago in 1960, or in New York City under Tammany Hall, or in Philadelphia in 1920. You shut down the count in the middle of the night when no one's watching, you lock the doors, and then you quickly count all the ballots, and you see how your candidate stands with regard to the opposition. And if your candidate's behind, you frantically do one of two things. You either start discarding ballots for your opponent, or you start manufacturing ballots for your guy, or you do both. All right? So in the middle of the night, simultaneously in all of these swing states, the Democrat secretaries of state, or the Democrat local officials in Fulton County, Georgia, for example, in Maricopa County, and in Phoenix, Arizona, the local campaign official, a Democrat, shut down the vote count in order to find out where they were. And I think they were aghast at how far behind they were. Yeah. And that's when the real shenanigans began. And because they were in a hurry, and because they had so many votes to manufacture, they made it really obvious on the computer systems. They've made it really obvious in leaving a paper trail for some of the paper ballots they manufactured. For example, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, Milwaukee is about an hour north of Illinois. And in the middle of the night in Milwaukee, you have 3 cars with out-of-state license plates come up to the mail-in ballot voting counting center and drop off boxes and boxes of ballots, which must have been hastily printed somewhere and driven up because, why? Because Biden was so far behind. Now, I believe, look, now my final point here is this. We can talk about ballot fraud all day, John Henry, because it just goes on. The stories just get better and better, or actually, depending on how you want to look at it, they get worse and worse. But people need to stay calm. They need to stay focused. This is all coming out. No one has been certified yet. No state has certified the vote count. This is going to take time to wind its way through the judicial process, to wend its way through the state legislatures, who have the ultimate authority. The state legislatures have the ultimate authority to send a slate of electors to Washington, D.C. to vote on who the next president is on December 14th. That's up to the state legislature. And it is within the realm of possibility that if the courts don't provide a sufficient remedy, that the state legislature of a state like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan, which is a Republican-controlled legislature, will say there has been so much fraud in the state of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan that we're going to intervene, and we're going to, in order to protect the clear will of the people of our state who voted for Trump, we're going to send a Trump slate of electors to Washington, D.C. to vote for Trump. But I don't think it's going to come to that. In most states, I think the fraud is so evident, so obvious, and hundreds. There are literally, in the Trump campaign team now, there are teams of attorneys and volunteers, lots and lots of volunteers. You can imagine how the MAGA crowd is coming out in places like Georgia and Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona to help. There are teams of lawyers and teams of volunteers who are taking statements from witnesses about old school voter fraud and are getting affidavits from computer programmers about new school voter fraud. So the evidence is going to be overwhelming. And don't listen to the mainstream media now. And I'm very disappointed in Fox, for example, because the word came down from Rupert Murdoch and his sons that they were going to shift sides, and they've shifted sides in a big way. They've been part of this coup attempt to force us to accept the results of a fraudulent election before the legal process and the electoral process laid out by the Constitution of the United States is actually allowed to operate. So this is a coup attempt underway. It will be stopped. Trump will win, but it's going to take time. And in the meantime, we just need to stay strong, support the president, who is the most pro-life, pro-family president that this country has had in a long time, and a man whom I and Archbishop Vigano and others believe the hand of God is upon.
Amen. Wow. So this is actually, it's very hopeful. It's also very scary because this is now winding through the courts. You say that there is enough evidence. It seems clear. I mean, it's funny what you said about they gaslighted themselves. It's so true. Anybody who was watching, and I guess not the mainstream media because they never showed you, but anybody who was watching the Trump rallies, you could see there's hundreds of thousands of people in every single jurisdiction wherever Trump goes, and there's 5 people standing in circles when Biden shows up. It was ridiculous to think that Trump wouldn't massively beat Biden in this election.
Yeah.
So
6,000 people in Butler, Pennsylvania, and you're telling me that Pennsylvania voted for the guy in the basement? You know, this contradicts common sense. But my favorite staged Biden rally is actually the one in which he came out last Friday and he gave a speech about how he was certain that he was winning the election. There in front of him were a whole parking lot of empty Jeeps, red, white, blue Jeeps. They were empty, John Henry.
Oh no!
They were empty. They were just there. They went to the local Jeep dealership and got all the red, white, and blue Jeep
Oh,
and
God.
put them out in front so it looked like there were people sitting in their cars. And of course, what did the mainstream media do? They didn't show the empty cars. They allowed this staged propaganda Potemkin village of a speech to go, unexposed to the American people. So the mainstream media has betrayed us. They're part of the coup attempt, this bloodless coup that they attempted that is going to fail, and they're the Titanic. It's new media like the show that we're doing right now, where you have a couple hundreds of thousands of subscribers. You will have more as time goes on, because people are looking for the truth, and they won't find it on MSNBC and CNN. We've known that for a long time, but they also won't find it on Fox. But they will find it here, John Henry. So I'm grateful to you for doing this.
Oh, praise God for that. There is another aspect to this that I'd like you to address, and that is that what's going on psychologically. So this is a war that obviously has been done via cheating of all sorts, very sophisticated, old style, all this. It's going to come out in the courts. But there's another war going on as we speak. Biden claims the victory early. He falsely puts this up. He goes, has this so-called victory speech where he's all, oh, now let's all be one America and all this nonsense. Totally in the face of being treasonous himself, which is a totally other story with all of the China revelations and the Ukraine revelations. But nonetheless, he's giving this false notion. And then you have the likes of international leaders, and God forbid, but it was, even the Pope, calling Biden to so-called congratulate him on his win. Complete fabrication. Now, it's invested the people of the United States to, I think, a majority, because they're listening to the mainstream media, they're watching these world leaders, including the Pope, call up Biden and call this election for him, if you will. This is creating massive future problems, because as most of us who are paying attention know, it's going to be ruled in the courts, obviously in Trump's favor, but it's going to create massive consternation and possibly even violence.
Well, let me say, first of all, about that, John Henry, that they picked the wrong guy to try to intimidate. All right. Now, if this had been taken place, and I think there was some voter fraud against Romney and McCain back in 2008, 2012, and I think there was voter fraud attempts in 2016. They didn't realize how much the American people, even in 2016, were willing to trust a novice politician, a businessman, with the reins of government in the United States, because of how much they distrusted the old politician by the name of Hillary Clinton. And so I think there was cheating in 2016, but I don't think they were ready for the magnitude of Trump's victory even then. And so he was able to carry Wisconsin by 10,000 votes. Why didn't Hillary Clinton challenge the voting results in 2016 in these states which were so narrowly and hotly contested? Because she knew that if she did, the voter fraud that they had attempted at that time would be revealed. So it wasn't to her advantage to go to court, because that would enable the discovery process, and the fraud would have been revealed at that time, and Trump's margin in Wisconsin would have gone from 10,000, 50,000, or 100,000. But their problem is much more serious now. But they picked on the wrong guy to try to bulldoze, because if they'd done this, did this to McCain or Romney, they would have just quietly folded up their tents and went home. In fact, that's what they did. They didn't challenge the results of the election. And I think they thought that if they piled on Donald Trump, if they simply had the mainstream media simultaneously, in conjunction with Fox, call the election for Biden, if all the newspapers were shouting out that Biden had won, if the foreign leaders were calling in congratulating President-elect Biden, that Trump would simply lose heart. This is a man who never gives up. This is a man who never stops fighting. This is a man who, for the last 4 years, has been under constant assault. The Mueller investigation, right? The phony dossier, the impeachment hoax, all of this nonsense going on and on and on. He never gives up. If there's one thing that we need to know about Donald Trump, is that he's the Rock. He will never give up. He will fight to the bitter end, and he's won every battle so far, and he's going to win this one as well. You will see fake stories. The media continues to gaslight us. Melania Trump can send out a tweet saying, I am absolutely supportive of my husband's effort to end electoral fraud in this country, and he has won the election. And the mainstream CNN will report that Melania is advising her husband to concede. I mean, they report the opposite of the truth. It is absolutely insane. We talk about Trump derangement syndrome. It is on full display right now. He won't back down. He won't give up. He's his favorite general is General George Patton, and Patton never gave up. Patton understood the best defense is a good offense, and that's what Trump is doing now. Now, a lot of this stuff is occurring behind the scenes, right? We're gathering affidavits. Witnesses are coming forward by the hundreds, literally, direct witnesses to voter fraud of various kinds. It takes time to take their testimony. It takes time to write it down into an affidavit and have it signed and notarized. It takes time to put all those affidavits together and assemble court cases. We're moving at the speed of light. We've already put a court case in Wisconsin. I think it's 254 pages long, and the appendices are all the affidavits, which goes on longer than that. So, I mean, things are moving ahead, but a lot of this is occurring out of sight. But I think that our listeners should be confident in the outcome of the election, and they should not lose heart. They should do this, though. They should pray for their country, the United States of America, and they should pray for our president that God strengthen him in this moment, because this is a second American Revolution. This is the greatest challenge that the American system of limited government has faced since Civil War. We're right in the middle of the Civil War now. It's a bloodless Civil War. Hopefully it will remain bloodless. I think it will. There will be some violence when President Trump is declared to be the winner of the election and goes forward into a second term. Antifa and BLM will crawl out from under the rocks under which they're currently hiding, and there will be some violence in the streets of Democrat-run cities. Note that the windows of the stores in Washington, D.C., and New York City, and Pittsburgh, and Minneapolis are still boarded up today. And they're not boarded up because they're afraid that MAGA supporters are going to come in and start breaking windows. They're worried that their own agitators in their own cities, which have been encouraged by the democratic machines that run those cities, are going to turn on them in anger when this election is called for the true winner of the election contest. So I believe that foreign leaders, I was very sorry to see that Pope Francis decided that he was going to decide who the winner of the American election is, because he called the wrong guy. There are others who haven't, of course. The president of Mexico.
That was very good to see. It was very good to see that he would not call this early, even when pressed by his own press people. He remained very firm in saying that this was not done yet.
Right. So it's not yet, and we need to pray for our president. We need to get down on our knees before the Blessed Sacrament, as I and my staff and family are doing, and pray for God's intervention in this. And John Henry, we know that God intervenes in the affairs of men, and we know that in fact in the Battle of Lepanto, we all know the Battle of Lepanto, how it turned out because of the intervention, the praying of the Rosary by faithful Catholics. But I tell a more recent story. And that's the story of the People Power Revolution in the Philippines back in the 1980s, 1986, when millions of people came out in the streets of Manila and demanded an end to dictatorship. Ferdinand Marcos had ruled the Filipinos with an iron hand for decades, and the Filipinos decided it was time for him to leave. And there was a real threat that there would be bloodshed on the streets, bloodshed of the kind that we later saw in Tiananmen Square, for example, where 10,000 people were shot down or run down by tanks in the streets of the capital city. And we were afraid that the same thing would happen in the streets of Manila. It didn't happen because of prayer of faithful Catholics in the Philippines. And what happened was this: I had dinner with Cardinal Jaime Sin, who was then the Cardinal Archbishop of Manila at the time of the People Power Revolution. And he told me what had happened. This was several years later. He recounted the story to me. He said, when the people began to come out in the streets of Manila, I was afraid that deadly violence would break out, that Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator, was threatening to open fire on the people of the Philippines. So he said, I called all of the convents in the country, and I told the nuns to get down on their knees before the Blessed Sacrament and to raise their hands to heaven, as Moses did in the Old Testament, and pray fervently for God's intercession. And what happened when the crowds approached the palace in which the dictator Marcos was hiding out? He ordered his palace guard to go out and put down the rebellion. And the palace guard went out, 500 of them went out with their weapons, and the commander of the guard said to the troops, ready, aim, and as he was about to say fire, a beautiful lady appeared in the sky in front of them, magnificent and larger than life, and all of the soldiers took their fingers off the trigger at the same time. Not a single shot was fired. So God does interfere in the affairs of men. We need to be praying for our country and our president at this time, and all will be well.